A single dad's car breaks down in the middle of nowhere with his daughter in the back seat. When a billionaire stops to help, it's the beginning of a ride that will take them somewhere neither of them ever expected. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind had a bite that morning, the kind that cut through Jason Hale's worn-out jacket and settled deep in his bones. Snow flurries danced across the empty stretch of highway, the sky above a dull, unforgiving gray. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as the car shuddered beneath him, its tired engine coughing like an old smoker on its last breath. "Come on, not now," he muttered, tapping the gas. The sedan gave a weak lurch, then sputtered once, twice, and died with a pitiful wheeze. Jason clenched his jaw and guided the car onto the shoulder as it coasted to a stop. Gravel popped under the tires. The silence that followed was loud. "Are we stopping?" came a small voice from the back seat. Olivia, bundled up in her thickest coat, peeked out from under her fuzzy hood, her eyes wide. He turned just enough to meet her gaze, forcing a smile. "Just taking a quick break, kiddo. Car's being a little stubborn today." Jason stepped into the cold, boots crunching against the icy roadside as he popped the hood. A thick puff of steam rose instantly, fogging his glasses. He wiped them with a sigh. Radiator was cooked, maybe the alternator too, hard to say without his tools, which were 20 miles away in his shop. Not that it mattered. The whole thing was running on prayers and duct tape anyway. He glanced down the highway, empty in both directions. No signal, no traffic, just white. Back in the car, Olivia was hugging her stuffed bear close, her breath fogging the window. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped snugly around her chin. Jason climbed in and pulled the door shut against the cold. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his hands together. "We'll figure it out. Might have to wait a bit, that's all." Olivia nodded, trusting him like she always did. He hated how much she did. Time passed. The cold started creeping in. Jason was beginning to weigh the risks of walking to the nearest gas station when headlights appeared, bright, clean, and out of place on this forgotten stretch of road. A sleek black SUV slowed as it approached, then stopped just ahead of them. Jason didn't know it yet, but this moment, this frozen, quiet morning, was the beginning of everything. The SUV's engine purred like a sleeping animal, its glossy black frame gleaming against the dull white snow and cracked pavement. Jason Hale narrowed his eyes as the vehicle came to a gentle stop just ahead, its tinted windows reflecting the pale winter light. It didn't belong out here, not on this forgotten stretch of highway with nothing but barren trees and faded road signs for miles. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man dressed in a charcoal wool coat, the kind you didn't find at second-hand stores. His boots were polished, his scarf effortlessly draped like he'd walked out of a fashion magazine. But there was nothing flashy about him. His movements were efficient, controlled, like a man used to solving problems quickly. Jason straightened as the man approached. He stood tall, early 40s maybe, with dark, well-kept hair and eyes that flicked from Jason to the broken-down car and then to the back seat, where Olivia sat watching from behind fogged-up glass. "Trouble?" the man asked, voice calm and clipped, like he hadn't planned on speaking much today. Jason gave a tired chuckle. "Yeah, you could say that. Radiator gave out, no signal, no help for miles." The man nodded once, already reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a phone. "I've got service. I can call someone for you." Jason shook his head. "Appreciate it, but it'll cost more than the car's worth. I'm just trying to get my daughter to school and maybe not freeze doing it." The man paused, glancing back at the SUV. "It's warm. You both can ride with me into town." Jason hesitated. Everything in him flinched at the offer, not because it sounded shady, but because it didn't. "Name's Daniel," the man added, sensing the hesitation. "Daniel Cross." Jason blinked. The name rang a bell, but not loudly. Somewhere in the blur of commercials and finance segments, he'd heard it. Tech company. Billions. That Daniel Cross. Jason looked down at the snow, then back at the SUV, then at Olivia's anxious face in the rearview mirror. You sure? Daniel nodded. No one should be stuck out here, especially with a kid. Jason sighed. All right, let me grab her things. As he opened the back door and unbuckled Olivia, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of billionaire stopped for strangers in the middle of nowhere, and what the hell this unexpected detour was going to mean. The interior of Daniel's SUV was like stepping into another world, one where the air smelled faintly of leather and cedar, the seats were butter soft, and the silence wasn't awkward but expensive. Jason sat stiffly in the front passenger seat, the seat warmer, already working against the cold that had settled into his bones. In the back, Olivia sat wide-eyed, her small hands buried in the sleeves of her coat, her pink backpack clutched tightly in her lap. Daniel drove smoothly, one hand on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The windshield wipers moved in a quiet rhythm, swiping away flakes of snow as they made their way toward town. For a while, no one spoke. Jason wasn't sure what to say. This man, Daniel Cross, wasn't just wealthy. He was otherworldly, confident, composed, the kind of guy who probably had assistants for his assistants. And yet here he was, chauffeuring a broke mechanic and his daughter to town, like it was the most normal thing in the world. It was Olivia who broke the silence. "Are you famous?" she asked, her voice small but curious. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror, a ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Not exactly. You look like someone who'd be in a movie," she continued, undeterred, "or on a cereal box." Jason let out a low chuckle despite himself. "Liv." Daniel laughed softly. "No cereal boxes, I promise. I run a company, mostly tech stuff. Very boring." "Like video games?" she asked hopefully. "Not quite. More like the software that helps people do their jobs." "Oh," Olivia said, clearly unimpressed. "That does sound boring." Daniel smiled again. "Trust me, it is." Jason stole a glance at the man behind the wheel. There was something disarming about how easily he was talking to Olivia, how normal he seemed despite the layers of wealth and polish. "You always drive yourself?" Jason asked. "Not usually," Daniel replied. "I was heading to a place out west. No signal, no staff, no meetings, just peace. Needed a break." Jason nodded, understanding that more than he expected. "Well," Daniel added, glancing between the two of them, "looks like that plan's already gone off course." Jason stared out at the snowy road, unsure whether to apologize or be quietly thankful. The diner sat just off the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly against the gray afternoon sky. Maggie's place, it read, though the G had given up weeks ago. It wasn't much, a squat little building with steamed-up windows and the scent of frying bacon drifting through the parking lot, but to Jason, it might as well have been a five-star resort. Daniel pulled the SUV into a spot near the entrance. "You two hungry?" he asked, glancing over. Jason hesitated. "You don't have to, "I know," Daniel said simply, "but we've all had a morning. Come on. My treat." Inside, the warmth hit them like a hug. Olivia's cheeks were pink from the cold, and she looked up at Jason, who gave her a small nod. She slipped into a booth by the window, tugging off her mittens. Jason slid in beside her, while Daniel took the seat across from them, removing his gloves with careful precision. The waitress arrived, cheerful and middle-aged, calling everyone Han as she poured coffee and handed over sticky, laminated menus. Olivia chose pancakes with a side of whipped cream. Jason asked for black coffee and the cheapest eggs and toast combo. Daniel ordered oatmeal, surprising Jason a little. "You ever eat at places like this?" Jason asked, only half joking. Daniel smiled. "More than you'd think. Grew up eating eggs and toast in places like this. My dad was a mechanic." That gave Jason pause. "Yeah?" Daniel nodded. "Single father. Worked 3 jobs. Thought the world of him, even when we had nothing." Jason looked down at his hands, calloused and cracked from years of labor. "Funny. I'm starting to think kids don't notice the paycheck so much as the effort." Daniel followed Jason's gaze to Olivia, who was now making a snowman out of syrup packets. "Seems like she's got a good one." Jason shrugged. "I do what I can." The food came, hot and hearty. Conversation slowed. But every so often Daniel's eyes would flick to Jason, not just with politeness, but with something deeper. Curiosity, maybe even admiration. In this cramped little booth over greasy coffee and pancakes, Daniel Cross saw something rare. A man who didn't need millions to live with purpose. A man who, without knowing it, carried something Daniel hadn't realized he'd been searching for. Quiet, unshakable grace. The wind had picked up by the time they stepped back outside, whistling through the gaps between buildings and sending flurries spinning across the parking lot. Olivia skipped ahead, energized by pancakes and maple syrup, her boots crunching on the snow as she chased her breath in the cold air. Jason walked slower, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, still processing everything, the SUV, the diner. Daniel Cross sitting across from him like he was just another guy on the road. Daniel followed behind, quiet but not distant. The keys to his SUV jingled faintly in his hand as he watched Olivia twirl in the snow. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at Jason. "You sure you're all right from here?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the highway. "I can drive you all the way into town." Jason shook his head. "Nah, Maggie said her cousin could give us a lift. He's got a tow truck and a space heater in the cab. We'll be okay." Daniel glanced down, then pulled a sleek black wallet from the inside of his coat. From it, he slid out a business card. Matte, minimalist, just a name and a number embossed in silver. He handed it to Jason, just in case. Jason took it slowly, feeling the unexpected weight of the gesture. "In case what?" Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. Something breaks. You need a hand? Or maybe I just want to know if that pancake snowman of hers ever gets finished." Jason laughed, folding the card between two fingers. "Appreciate it, but I'm not exactly in your world." Daniel met his eyes. "Maybe, but you've got something I don't." Jason tilted his head. "Yeah? What's that?" Daniel looked toward Olivia, now crouched beside a small drift, patting it into shape with gloved hands. Peace. A reason that doesn't come with a stock price. For a moment they stood there, not as billionaire and mechanic, but just two men watching a little girl play in the snow. "Well," Jason said, tucking the card into his wallet, "if your car ever breaks down in the middle of nowhere, you know where to find me." Daniel grinned. "Fair enough." They shook hands, firm, genuine. Then Daniel stepped back into his SUV, gave Olivia a small wave, and drove off into the falling snow. Jason stood watching the taillights disappear, one thought circling his mind. That wasn't nothing. The buzz of fluorescent lights and the bitter scent of motor oil greeted Jason Hale like a familiar sigh. The shop floor was cold, the concrete beneath his boots unforgiving, and the space heater in the corner barely made a dent against the February chill. He hung his jacket on the same crooked hook, wiped his hands on a rag that should have been retired months ago, and got to work. Back to reality. The last couple of days felt like they had belonged to someone else. A brief, strange detour into a world with heated leather seats, perfect coffee, and a billionaire named Daniel Cross. Now, it was all clunky transmissions, rusted bolts, and invoices that never seemed to match the money in the bank. He checked the clipboard hanging by the office door. 3 jobs lined up for the day. 1 brake job, 1 oil change, and a mystery rattle in a '99 pickup that probably wasn't worth the time it would take to find it. From the office, a muffled thud echoed, followed by a high-pitched giggle. Jason glanced over and smiled faintly. Olivia sat at the desk, hunched over her math homework, tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in deep concentration. They couldn't afford a sitter during school breaks, and Miss Caroline, from the front desk, was out sick. So the shop became her classroom, and Jason's hours stretched thin, trying to be both boss and dad. "Need help with that?" he called. Olivia looked up and shook her head. "It's just fractions. I'm a professional now." Jason chuckled and turned back to the busted-out brake rotor on the lift. He slipped into his routine easily, muscle memory doing most of the work while his thoughts wandered. He hadn't told anyone about Daniel, not because he didn't want to. He just didn't know how to explain it. It felt too strange, too big for this place, too far removed from patched tires and maxed-out credit cards. Still, every now and then, his fingers brushed the edge of the business card tucked in his wallet. He hadn't called. Wouldn't. Probably. But that quiet moment between fixing cars and microwaving dinner was enough for the question to creep in. What if? The sky was spitting rain by mid-morning, a cold, ugly drizzle that made everything feel heavier. Clouds, boots, thoughts. Jason Hale stood outside the shop's office, staring down at the envelope in his hand like it might disappear if he waited long enough. But it didn't. The words inside were real, stamped in bold letters at the top of the page. Notice of termination, effective immediately. Doug, the owner, hadn't even told him in person, just left the letter in an envelope taped to the office door like a dirty secret. "Sorry, Jay. Business is slow. Can't keep everyone." That was it. 15 years of wrench-turning, overnight shifts, staying late to help stranded moms, and driving out to farm roads in snowstorms, all of it swept out like garbage in a single piece of paper. Jason crumpled the letter in his fist and dropped it in the shop's trash bin. His jaw clenched. Olivia's sneakers squeaked behind him as she stepped into the office from the back room, holding a granola bar and wearing that too-big hoodie she loved. "You okay, Daddy?" she asked, brows drawn in concern. Jason forced a smile. "Yeah, Peanut. Just a mix-up with work." She didn't press. She never did. She trusted him too much. By the time they got home, the rain had turned to sleet. The heater in the apartment clicked on with a groan. Jason checked the mailbox. Past due notice for the electric bill, a final reminder from the landlord, and a grocery flyer that felt like a cruel joke. He sank into the couch and buried his face in his hands. Rent was due in 4 days. The last paycheck wouldn't stretch far enough. He had maybe half a tank of gas, no fallback plan, and the kind of pride that kept him from asking for help until it was way too late. And then he remembered. That card. Daniel Cross. Jason reached for his wallet and pulled it out, the silver letters still clean and crisp against the black. "Just in case," the man had said. Jason stared at it for a long moment, then set it down on the table like it might start ringing on its own. He didn't want to call, but something told him he might have to. The phone felt heavier than usual in Jason Hale's hand, like it somehow knew the weight of the moment. He sat at the kitchen table, elbows resting on the scuffed wood, Olivia humming softly from the floor as she colored a picture of a tree with stars for leaves. The card lay next to his coffee mug, as if daring him to pick it up. He'd stared at it for 2 nights now, just in case. Jason wasn't the kind of man who asked for favors. Life had taught him early that no one owed you anything, and pride was sometimes the only thing you had left when money ran out. But pride didn't pay rent, and Olivia, his everything, deserved more than empty cupboards and cold nights. So with a breath that felt like it scraped against his ribs, he punched the number into his phone and held it to his ear. It rang twice. Daniel Cross. The voice was calm, direct. Jason straightened instinctively, like he was back in school and just got called on. Hey, this is Jason, from the highway, the dad with the broken-down sedan." A pause, then warmth. "Jason Hale, thought I might hear from you." Jason exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Look, I'm not calling for charity. I'm out of work. Things are tight, real tight. I figured, if you've got something, anything you need help with, I'm your guy. No strings, no handouts." Another pause. Jason could almost hear Daniel thinking. "I actually might have something," Daniel said slowly. "I'm starting a road tour. Company outreach, for all of it. I'll be on the road for weeks, and I hate being chauffeured by people who talk like robots. I need someone who's good with cars, knows how to read a situation, and doesn't BS me." Jason blinked. "You want me to drive you around?" "Among other things," Daniel said. "You in?" Jason looked over at Olivia, now giggling as she tried to draw a cat in a tree. Her cheeks still had that pink glow from the cold. He turned back to the phone. "I'm in." Jason stood outside the modest apartment building, Olivia's hand in his, their breath visible in the morning air. The street was quiet, save for the occasional rumble of a passing delivery truck. He kept checking his watch, not because Daniel was late, he wasn't, but because this whole thing still felt surreal. A black SUV rolled around the corner, smooth and polished like before, and pulled to the curb in one seamless motion. Jason instinctively adjusted his jacket, brushing off invisible dust as Daniel stepped out, looking sharp in a dark wool coat and gloves that probably cost more than Jason's car had been worth before it died. "Morning," Daniel said, nodding toward Olivia. "Hey, kiddo." Olivia waved shyly, then ducked behind her dad's leg. Jason offered a nervous smile. "Didn't think you'd come all the way out here just to chat." Daniel opened the passenger door but didn't climb in. Instead, he leaned on it and looked directly at Jason. "I didn't come to chat. I came with an offer." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" "I meant what I said on the phone," Daniel continued. "I've got a multi-city corporate tour starting in less than a week. Speeches, meet and greets, stakeholder visits. It's going to be a logistical circus. I need someone on the ground with common sense who can drive, fix things if they break, and not pretend every word I say is brilliant." Jason folded his arms. "You want me to be your driver?" Daniel shook his head. "I want you to be part of my team. Driving is just part of it. You'd be close to the action, logistics, troubleshooting, maybe even speaking up in meetings if something doesn't pass the smell test. You're grounded, Jason. I need that." Jason looked down at Olivia, who was now examining the SUV like it was a spaceship. Then he looked back up. "Why me?" Daniel shrugged. "Because you didn't ask me for anything, and because you fixed my car and didn't flinch when you found out who I was." Jason hesitated for half a second longer. "What's the pay?" Daniel smiled. "Let's just say, more than enough." Jason extended his hand. "Then I guess I'm your guy." Daniel took it without hesitation. "You start Monday." The city hit like a wave, loud, fast, and too big to take in all at once. Jason Hale kept one hand steady on the wheel of Daniel's second SUV, a sleek graphite model with built-in GPS, automatic lane assist, and more buttons than he knew what to do with. Olivia sat in the back, her face pressed to the window, eyes wide as they passed block after block of towering glass buildings, endless traffic, and billboards the size of houses. "Is this all one place?" she asked, breath fogging the window. "Yep," Jason said. "Welcome to the city." The streets pulsed with energy, honking horns, flashing lights, the occasional impatient pedestrian darting across in front of them like they had somewhere far more important to be. It was a long way from their quiet neighborhood, where the loudest thing in the morning was the neighbor's dog barking at squirrels. Daniel had arranged for them to stay in a company-owned condo on the top floor of a luxury high-rise downtown. Jason had expected something decent, a clean apartment with heat, and maybe a working dishwasher. What they walked into was something out of a magazine. The elevator whooshed silently to the 23rd floor. When the doors opened, they stepped into a space with floor-to-ceiling windows, granite counters, gleaming floors, and a view of the skyline that didn't look real. Olivia gasped. "This is our house?" Jason stood still for a second. "Temporarily, he said, unsure if he was reassuring her or himself. There was a fridge already stocked, crisp white towels folded in the bathroom, and a welcome note with both their names written on it. Jason ran his hand over the back of the leather couch, still in disbelief. Later that afternoon, Daniel met them at the building's private garage. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, phone in one hand, coffee in the other, but he gave them a smile that was real. "You get settled in?" he asked. Jason just shook his head. "This place has a remote for the curtains." Daniel grinned. "Yeah, bit of a change." Jason looked around the garage, quiet, polished, no oil stains, no cracked cement, and let out a low whistle. "This is going to take some getting used to." The boardroom felt more like a museum than a meeting space. Glass walls, sleek furniture, and a massive table so polished it reflected the overhead lights like water. Jason Hale stood near the back, shoulders square, trying not to look as out of place as he felt in his cleanest button-down and second-hand slacks. A clipboard sat in his hand more out of instinct than purpose, and he kept shifting his weight, scanning the room full of suits and designer heels like he was waiting for someone to tell him he didn't belong. Daniel sat at the head of the table, calm and unreadable, flanked by a dozen sharp-eyed executives. Charts flickered on the screen at the far end. Revenue breakdowns, quarterly projections, overseas expansion. Words like optimization and leverage were thrown around like they meant something. Jason tried to keep up, but most of it sailed clean over his head. Still, he watched. He listened. He noticed how two of the suits on the right side of the table barely looked at Daniel when they spoke, but leaned in toward each other with every whispered comment. He noticed how a woman near the far end, a younger exec, early 30s maybe, kept trying to get a word in, only to be interrupted every time by the guy beside her. And he noticed the way Daniel's expression subtly shifted, cooler, tighter, each time the topic circled back to the European branch. "Any final thoughts before we move to approvals?" one of the board members asked. Daniel glanced across the room. "Jason?" Heads turned. Jason straightened, blinking. Me?" Daniel nodded, lips twitching into something that might have been a smirk. "You've been sitting back there for 40 minutes. What do you think?" Jason cleared his throat, painfully aware of a dozen skeptical eyes on him. "Well," he began slowly, "I don't speak MBA, but it seems like you've got a lot of people talking numbers and no one talking people. The woman down there," he nodded to the young exec, "had something to say, and no one let her. And the two over there, they've been whispering all meeting like they already made a decision before this thing started." Silence. Then, after a long pause, Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly entertained. "Noted," he said simply. "Meeting adjourned." As people gathered their things, whispering more now than before, Jason looked around, heart pounding, already regretting opening his mouth. But as Daniel passed him on the way out, he clapped a hand on Jason's shoulder and said quietly, "Exactly why you're here." The nanny arrived precisely at 8 o'clock a.m., dressed in smart slacks, a pastel blouse, and holding a clipboard that looked like it had never been bent or scribbled on. Her name was Marlene, and she came with glowing references, years of experience, and a tone of voice that made everything sound like a polite command. Jason stood awkwardly in the condo foyer, Olivia by his side with her backpack already slung over one shoulder. "She's real nice, Daddy," Olivia whispered, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Jason crouched down. "Just for a few days while I'm on the job, all right? I'll be close." She nodded, but he could see the worry creeping into the corners of her expression. That day, Jason rode along with Daniel to the first of many corporate site visits. Office tours, PR stops, meet and greets with local partners. It was all fast-paced and meticulously scheduled. Jason handled the routes, coordinated last-minute changes, and quietly kept Daniel's day running smooth. But his mind drifted back to Olivia more than once. By the time they returned to the condo that evening, Jason's shoulders were tight with worry. The moment he stepped inside, he could hear soft piano music coming from the living room, but it wasn't Marlene's calm voice reading aloud from a picture book. It was Daniel's. He sat cross-legged on the floor beside Olivia, both of them leaning over a tablet screen as a digital piano app lit up with bouncing notes. Olivia giggled, tapping along, and Daniel, still in his crisp button-up shirt and tie, loosened around his neck, smiled like someone who'd forgotten what a real laugh sounded like. Jason paused in the doorway, speechless. Marlene appeared from the kitchen, holding her coat and purse. She wasn't responding much today, a little quiet, distracted. But then Mr. Cross got home early. Took 2 minutes, and she lit up like a Christmas tree. She offered a smile. Some kids just know who they feel safe with. Jason watched as Olivia proudly hit the right note and looked up at Daniel, eyes shining. Daniel ruffled her hair gently. "Not bad, Maestro," he said. Jason's chest tightened, not with jealousy, but something warmer, something unexpected. Maybe this wasn't just a job anymore. The elevator doors whispered open on the 23rd floor, revealing the condo's sleek marble entryway and panoramic skyline view. Jason Hale stepped in, his boots, still dusty from the afternoon site visit, leaving faint marks on the pristine floor. He exhaled and ran a hand through his hair, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor, and everything to do with the invisible weight he'd been carrying lately. The days had become a strange rhythm, mornings filled with coffee served in porcelain cups, high-rise boardrooms, and conversations about investments and global strategy, words that didn't stick, no matter how many times he heard them. Afternoons were a blur of routes, tight schedules, and Daniel's unspoken trust that Jason would keep the machine running. And evenings, they were the quiet ones, watching Olivia draw on the window with her fingers while the city glowed below her like a sea of stars. He poured himself a cup of cheap coffee he'd bought out of habit and stared down at his reflection in the kitchen's polished counter. His hands were still calloused, his nails perpetually smudged with grease that never quite washed out. Yet here he was, living in a place with smart lights and a fridge that told him when the milk was low. The contrast wasn't just jarring, it was disorienting. That morning, he'd passed a construction crew working a few blocks down. For a moment, he'd slowed the car and rolled the window down just to hear the clang of metal and the low hum of machinery. Familiar sounds, honest ones. One of the guys had looked over, nodding at Jason like he might have once worked beside him. Maybe he had. But then Jason had pulled away in a luxury SUV and turned into an underground garage where valet stood waiting to open his door. He looked up as Olivia came padding in, wearing a fluffy bathrobe 2 sizes too big and holding a bowl of cereal. "Want some?" she offered. Jason smiled. "Nah, kiddo, you enjoy it." She curled up beside him on the couch, flipping through her coloring book, completely at ease. Jason stared out the window, caught between 2 worlds, the one he knew and the one he was starting to understand, and wondering if he'd ever truly belong to either. It was past midnight when Jason found Daniel on the condo's balcony, leaning against the railing, a tumbler of something amber in his hand. The city pulsed quietly beneath them, lights twinkling, traffic whispering along the streets below. Jason had just come out to grab some air, but the look on Daniel's face stopped him short. Not the polished CEO look he wore in boardrooms, but something stripped down, unguarded. "You ever wonder how you ended up where you are?" Daniel asked without turning. Jason hesitated, then stepped forward. "Lately? Yeah, every day." Daniel exhaled, long and slow. "People always think this," he gestured out toward the skyline, "was some straight line, like I had a plan. I didn't." Jason leaned beside him, folding his arms. "Pretty sure no one plans for life to go sideways. It just does." Daniel nodded. "I grew up in a 1-bedroom apartment above a liquor store. My dad fixed cars. My mom cleaned houses until her back gave out. When I was 16, I figured out I could make money fixing people's computers instead of lawnmowers. By 22, I had my first startup. By 25, I had my first betrayal." Jason looked over. "What happened?" Daniel took a sip from the glass. "My best friend, guy I started everything with, sold our code to a competitor behind my back, signed his name on work we built together, got rich. I got humiliated." Jason let that sit for a beat. "You bounced back." "I did, But I stopped letting people in after that. No partners, no trust, just control. He looked down at his drink, then at Jason. But you? You don't flinch. You tell the truth even when no one asks for it. You make people feel like they matter. That's rare. Jason shifted, caught off guard. I'm just trying to survive, man. Keep my daughter fed. That's the only thing I know for sure. Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe that's why I keep pulling you into meetings. Because survival, when it comes from the right place, looks a lot like leadership. For a long moment they stood in silence, two men from two very different worlds, bound by bruised beginnings and the quiet understanding that some scars run deeper than money can ever reach. Olivia's birthday had almost slipped past Jason, between the job, the long days, the blinding speed of this new life. But Daniel hadn't forgotten. It started with a single question over breakfast. How old is Olivia turning? Daniel asked casually, stirring cream into his coffee. 8, Jason replied, not looking up from his planner. She never asks for much. We usually just do cupcakes and a movie at home. Daniel said nothing more, just nodded. But by that evening, everything had changed. Jason stepped off the elevator with Olivia's hand in his, expecting a quiet dinner after a long day. Instead, the condo was glowing with warm light, decorated top to bottom in soft pinks, shimmering silver balloons, and a banner that read, Happy Birthday, Olivia, in hand-lettered gold foil. Jason froze. Olivia gasped. In the middle of it all stood Daniel, sleeves rolled up, a sheepish grin on his face. Hope you don't mind, I made a few calls. There was a 3-tier cake on the counter, a mountain of presents stacked near the window, and even a small table with art supplies and coloring books, things Jason had never been able to give her all at once. Is this for me? Olivia whispered. Daniel knelt down to her level, every bit of it. Jason watched her throw her arms around Daniel's neck without hesitation, and something deep in his chest twisted, grateful, stunned, and maybe a little overwhelmed. The evening was magic. A local baker had made the cake, chocolate with strawberry filling, Olivia's favorite. One of Daniel's assistants had tracked down a doll Olivia had once mentioned in passing. There was even a tiny indoor tent where she and a couple of Daniel's employees' kids played, giggling like they'd known each other forever. Jason found himself on the balcony later, trying to catch his breath. Daniel joined him, hands in his pockets. Did I overdo it? Jason shook his head slowly. You didn't have to do any of it. Daniel looked inside through the glass, watching Olivia twirl in her new dress. Maybe I needed to. Jason didn't respond. He just looked at his daughter, glowing, laughing, loved, and wondered how he'd ever repay a man who had just given her something she'd never forget. It started with a blurry photo. Jason saw it the next morning, half asleep with coffee in hand, scrolling through his phone out of habit. The headline hit like a punch to the gut. Billionaire Daniel Cross spotted with mystery man and child, family or fling. He sat up straighter, jaw tightening as he opened the article. There it was, him, Olivia, and Daniel, leaving the high-rise lobby the day of the birthday party. Olivia's hand was in Daniel's, Jason walking just a step behind. The angle made it look intimate, intentional. He barely made it through the first few sentences. Words like secret family, rumored partner, and unexpected fatherhood jumped off the screen. The tone was all speculation and smirking sarcasm, but the implication was clear. Jason tossed the phone on the couch like it had burned him. He looked toward the bedroom where Olivia was still asleep, her stuffed bear curled beneath one arm. She had no idea the world was spinning outside their little bubble. An hour later, he was in Daniel's office, door shut, blinds drawn. You've seen it? Jason asked, pacing. Daniel leaned against his desk, arms crossed. Of course I have. And? Daniel was calm, too calm. We expected this eventually. People don't like not knowing things about public figures. They fill in the blanks. Jason shook his head. They called me your partner, Daniel. Said Olivia might be yours. She's 8, for God's sake. Daniel's expression darkened. I've already called PR. They'll kill the story in 24 hours. Jason stared at him, voice low. You don't get it. You're used to this kind of noise. I'm not. My kid isn't. Daniel didn't argue. For once, the man who always had a solution was quiet. Jason rubbed the back of his neck, trying to steady the rising storm inside. I didn't sign up for this. We're not built for headlines. Daniel finally spoke, softer this time. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did Olivia. People will talk, then they'll move on. Jason wanted to believe that, but as he walked out of the office, a knot settled in his chest. The line between their two worlds wasn't just blurry anymore. It was under a spotlight. The invitation came in a crisp white envelope, hand-delivered by a concierge who looked like he ironed his soul every morning. Jason turned it over in his hands, brow furrowed. Thick cardstock. Gold foil lettering. Vanessa Langford invites you to a private charity gala. Black tie. He didn't recognize the name, but when he showed the invite to Daniel later that evening, Daniel let out a breath through his nose and muttered, Of course she did. Jason raised an eyebrow. Old friend? Daniel set his glass down. Old everything. Vanessa Langford, socialite, investor, and the media's favorite definition of power couple back when we were one. Jason tried to keep his face neutral. So, she's your ex? Daniel nodded. In every possible way. We were good for the cameras, bad for each other. She liked attention. I liked building things. Eventually, I realized I was a line in her biography. Jason leaned back in his seat, letting that sink in. She know about me? Oh, she will now, Daniel said, his tone clipped. She doesn't miss a headline. The gala was at a private venue with chandeliers like upside-down ice sculptures and waiters who moved like shadows. Jason felt like he'd stumbled into a world made of glass, fragile, polished, and way too easy to break. Daniel wore the suit like he'd been born in it. Jason wore his like it might turn back into a pumpkin at midnight. Olivia had stayed with a sitter, thankfully. This wasn't her kind of night. And then she appeared, Vanessa. Red dress, bold lipstick, and a smile that could cut diamonds. She swept across the room like it belonged to her and stopped just short of Daniel. Darling, she purred, leaning in for a kiss that landed just to the side of his cheek. Her eyes flicked to Jason like he was a fingerprint on her wine glass. And you must be the mechanic. Jason straightened, but said nothing. Vanessa's smile sharpened. You've been making quite a splash. Headlines, birthday parties, driving Mr. Cross all over the city. Must be exhausting. Daniel stepped in, voice cool. Vanessa, don't start. But she wasn't done. Just remember, Daniel, she said lightly, turning away. You always did love projects, until you didn't. As she disappeared into the crowd, Jason watched Daniel's jaw tighten and knew this wasn't over. The city lights glowed outside the window, hazy through a drizzle that smeared the skyline into soft streaks of gold and gray. Jason stood in the corner of the condo's living room, arms crossed, still wearing the suit from the gala, though the tie was long gone and the top buttons undone. He hadn't said much since they got back, but the silence was starting to take up too much space. Daniel poured himself a drink, something dark and expensive, then offered the bottle toward Jason. He shook his head. I'm not here for the bourbon, Jason said flatly. Daniel paused. All right, let's talk. Jason looked up, jaw tight. What are we doing here, Daniel? Daniel raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean this, Jason said, stepping forward. All of it. The job, the condo, the dinners, the birthday party. You pull me into boardrooms, ask my opinion like I'm part of something bigger, and then let me get blindsided by your ex like I'm just another name on your payroll. Daniel didn't flinch. He set the glass down slowly, carefully. I never said this would be simple. I'm not asking for simple, Jason said. I'm asking for honest. Are we friends? Am I just a convenient piece of your PR image? Or am I something else to you? Because if this is just a gig, I need to know." Daniel was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual polish. "You're the first person in years who doesn't want something from me," he said. "Not money, not exposure, not a title. You're here because you show up, because you're real. And somewhere along the line, that stopped feeling like business and started feeling personal." Jason exhaled, slow and heavy, then stopped treating me like I'm replaceable. "You're not," Daniel said, stepping closer. "That's the problem. You're not just a driver or a mechanic. You're the first real person I've trusted in a very long time." They stood there, two men from opposite worlds, the air thick with unspoken truths and something almost like understanding. Jason broke the tension first. "Just don't expect me to wear that suit again." Daniel cracked a smile. "Fair enough." The tension hit like a sucker punch. Jason hadn't meant to linger outside the conference room. He was just early, coffee in hand, double-checking the transport schedule for the next leg of Daniel's tour. But the door was cracked open, and a voice, sharp, smug, carried through the gap before he could move away. "Let's be honest," came the voice, unmistakably clipped and condescending. "This whole thing with the mechanic, Jason, or whatever his name is, it's a goodwill stunt. Makes Cross look grounded. Human. Like he's not just a billionaire in a glass tower." Another voice chuckled. "A charity case with a kid. Classic PR gold." Jason froze. "I mean, come on. He's got dirt under his nails and drives Cross around like he's auditioning for a reality show. You don't actually think Daniel's serious about this guy, do you?" "I think Daniel's lonely," someone replied, "and sometimes even rich men want to feel like they've got roots again. He'll get over it." Jason turned and walked away, heart pounding. The hallway blurred. The coffee burned his hand, but he didn't feel it. He didn't wait for the meeting. Didn't wait for Daniel. By the time the elevator doors closed, his fists were clenched and his throat was dry. Later that night, Daniel came back to the condo, shrugging off his coat and calling out, "Jason, you here?" Silence. Then Jason stepped out from the kitchen, eyes cold. "What am I to you, Daniel?" Daniel blinked. "What?" "I overheard your board," Jason said, voice low. "They think I'm your pet project, a charity case to make you look good." Daniel's face shifted. "That's not what this is. You know that." "Do I?" Jason asked, the hurt breaking through. "Because I don't belong in your meetings or your world, and apparently everyone knows it but me." Daniel stepped forward. "Jason, you do belong. What they said, doesn't matter," Jason cut in, "because you didn't shut it down." Silence stretched between them, too thick to ignore. Jason grabbed his coat, not waiting for a response. "I can't be the guy who's only here because it makes you feel better about yourself." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a final echoing click. Daniel stood there staring at it, realizing too late what he'd let slip through the cracks. Maplewood was quieter than Jason remembered. The streets were still lined with bare trees and leaning mailboxes, and the corner diner still had the same flickering open sign that buzzed faintly in the cold morning air. As he pulled into the gravel driveway of the small rental house, his old one, the one he'd left behind just weeks ago, it felt like stepping into a dream he hadn't finished having. The familiar creak of the porch boards under his boots was oddly comforting. Olivia jumped out of the truck behind him, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and looked around with wide eyes. "Are we really back?" she asked. Jason nodded, swallowing a tightness in his throat. "Yeah, peanut, for now." The landlord had left the key under the same loose brick. The furniture was gone, but the walls still carried the scent of motor oil, cinnamon toast, and long nights at the kitchen table trying to stretch paychecks across overdue bills. Jason dropped their bags inside and looked around, unsure if this felt like home or like failure dressed in flannel. He'd sent Daniel a message 2 nights ago, short, polite, final. "Thanks for everything. We're heading home." No response. Maybe that was for the best. Jason spent the next few days trying to fall back into the rhythm of Maplewood. He reconnected with his old boss at Harrison's Auto Repair, who offered him part-time hours and a handshake that said, "No questions asked." Olivia went back to her old school, greeted by a few familiar faces and a seat near the window where she used to draw during recess. Everything was fine, normal, safe. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. Not just the condo or the job or the skyline view, something deeper. The way Daniel had looked at Olivia like she mattered. The way Jason had started to believe he was capable of more than scraping by. Late at night, when Olivia was asleep in her old bed with her bear tucked under her arm, Jason would sit at the kitchen table and stare at the silent phone, wondering. Had he made the right call, or had he just walked away from the first real chance he'd had in years? The penthouse was silent. Too silent. Daniel Cross stood in the center of the sprawling living room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows and the glittering cityscape beyond, but the view felt cold now, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The usual low hum of conversation, the sound of Olivia giggling as she slid across the hardwood in her socks, or Jason humming quietly while making breakfast, all of it was gone. The condo had never felt this empty before, not even when it was filled with people. He walked past the kitchen, where Olivia had once lined up her cereal boxes like they were museum pieces. A crayon drawing still clung to the side of the fridge, slightly crooked. Olivia plus Daniel plus Daddy, all holding hands under a lopsided sun. He hadn't taken it down. Daniel poured himself a drink but didn't take a sip. He just stood there staring at the glass, replaying Jason's last words in his mind. "I can't be the guy who's only here because it makes you feel better about yourself." It hadn't been true, not even close. But Daniel hadn't said that, not when it mattered. He'd let the silence speak for him, His assistant had asked if he wanted the usual prep for next quarter's media tour. He'd canceled it. The car Jason used to drive sat untouched in the garage, and when the board called to discuss the next expansion strategy, Daniel had listened on mute, barely hearing a word. For the first time in years, he didn't care about projections or headlines or mergers. He cared about a mechanic with worn-out boots and a stubborn sense of pride. About a little girl who called him D and insisted he learn the piano app on her tablet. He cared about the way they filled a space, not with noise, but with meaning. Daniel ran a hand over his face and sat down heavily on the couch. No PR team could fix this. No buyout or strategic pivot would bring them back. He had built an empire on logic and control, but now, for the first time, he was left with nothing but silence, and the growing, hollow ache of regret. The envelope arrived late in the afternoon, slipped into the stack of mail by a doorman who barely made eye contact. Daniel might have missed it entirely, if not for the small, uneven handwriting scrawled across the front. Mr. Daniel Cross. No return address, no logo, just a plain white envelope with a child's careful print. He set his phone down, ignoring the back-to-back emails about an upcoming investor roundtable, and opened the envelope with cautious fingers. Inside was a sheet of lined notebook paper, folded into quarters, creased, and a little smudged with what looked like colored pencil. "Dear Daniel, hi, it's Olivia." Daniel smiled faintly. He sat down on the edge of the couch, already feeling the weight of the words before finishing the first line. "Thank you for my birthday party. I never had one like that before. I liked the cake the most, but the best part was you playing piano with me, even though you weren't that good." The smile tugged wider for a moment before fading into something quieter. "Daddy says we're back home now because we needed to be. But he's sad sometimes, even when he says he's not. I can tell. He misses the city. I think he misses you too." Daniel swallowed hard. "I miss you. The big windows, the pancakes, the way you looked at Daddy like he wasn't just fixing things, but like he mattered. Most grown-ups don't do that." The writing wobbled a little near the bottom, like she'd paused or maybe pressed too hard with the pencil. "If you want to talk to Daddy again, you should. He might not say it, but he's waiting. I know. Love, Olivia. There was a tiny doodle of her bear next to her name, crooked and perfect. Daniel stared at the letter for a long time, the paper trembling just slightly between his fingers. In boardrooms, he'd negotiated billion-dollar deals with a poker face. But these few innocent sentences from an 8-year-old hit harder than anything ever had. She hadn't said much, but she'd said everything. The bell above the garage door jingled weakly as Daniel stepped into Harrison's auto repair, its chime drowned by the whirring sound of a nearby drill and the steady rhythm of country music playing on an old radio in the corner. Jason Hale looked up from beneath the hood of a beat-up pickup, his wrench pausing mid-turn. For a moment he didn't move, just stared. Daniel hadn't called, hadn't emailed, just showed up, dressed in jeans and a jacket that looked far too casual for someone with a Forbes profile. "Thought you were allergic to grease," Jason said, finally straightening and wiping his hands on a rag. Daniel cracked a half smile. "Turns out I missed the smell." Jason didn't smile back. "What are you doing here?" Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Not a contract, not a printed job description, just his handwriting, ink slightly smudged, as if he'd rewritten it a few times before getting it right. "I'm not here to offer you a job," Daniel said. "I'm here to offer a partnership." Jason raised an eyebrow, cautious. "Partnership in what?" "In you," Daniel said. "You've got something people trust, that I trust. And I've been sitting in that penthouse trying to figure out why losing you and Olivia hit harder than losing half my boardroom. I don't want a driver. I don't want a mechanic. I want someone who builds with me, on the ground, where it matters." Jason took the paper and unfolded it. It was a proposal to co-found a new auto tech initiative, community-based, accessible, and geared toward real-world impact. Mobile repair clinics, job training, outreach to small towns and rural schools. No corporate fluff, just work that mattered. "I've got the funding," Daniel added, "but I need your roots, your voice, your honesty. I want to build something people believe in, and that I can believe in too." Jason stared at the paper, then at Daniel. "You really drove all this way to ask me that?" Daniel nodded. "No driver this time, just me." Jason folded the page slowly, thoughtfully. "Well," he said, a small smile creeping in, "guess I better clear some space on the lift." Jason sat on the back steps of the house just after sundown, the sky above Maplewood painted in soft oranges and fading purples. Olivia was inside, sprawled on the living room rug, humming to herself as she colored a picture of a city skyline, Daniel's city, drawn with 8-year-old hands and bright imagination. The paper Daniel had handed him earlier rested in Jason's lap, corners creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. He read it again, not because he needed to, but because it grounded him. Every line spoke of something bigger than a paycheck. It wasn't just a job. It was a chance to build something that could outlast both of them. But it scared him. He'd always defined his worth by work he could touch. Things he could fix, cars, engines, broken timing belts, simple things with cause and effect. You didn't guess at whether a spark plug was good, you checked. You didn't hope a wrench fit, you knew. But this? Starting something new, leading, trusting? That was fuzzier, harder to measure. He looked down at his hands, rough, calloused, scarred. Hands that had changed oil and held his daughter, and once upon a time buried his dreams just to make it through another month. And now, out of nowhere, a man like Daniel Cross had come back into his life, not to save him, but to build with him, as equals. "Daddy?" Olivia peeked out the screen door, her voice soft. "Are we going back to the city?" Jason looked at her, eyes wide, hopeful but not needy. She'd be okay either way, she always was. He'd taught her resilience, but what he wanted now was to teach her something more. That it was okay to reach higher. That taking a risk didn't always mean gambling. It could mean growing. He reached out and pulled her onto his lap, holding her close as the sky dimmed. "Yeah, kiddo," he said, resting his chin on her hair. "I think it's time we go build something new." And just like that, the decision was made, not with his ego, but with his heart. He didn't want riches, he wanted meaning. And for the first time in a long time, he saw a road ahead worth following. The old hardware store on Main Street had been empty for years, windows streaked with dust, its front sign sun-faded and half-hanging from rusted chains, but today it buzzed with life. The doors were wide open, fresh paint gleamed on the brick walls. A new sign hung proudly above the entrance, Rootworks Auto and Tech. Jason Hale stood out front in a clean gray work shirt with his name stitched in cursive over the chest. Olivia clung to his side, proudly holding a pair of oversized scissors for the ribbon cutting. Daniel stood just behind them, sleeves rolled up, a grin tugging at his mouth, like he still couldn't believe this was real. They'd spent weeks turning the place into a hybrid repair shop and training center, bays for engine work, lifts for diagnostics, a side wing with workstations for coding and systems repair. Daniel's influence written all over it, but the heart of it, that was Jason. Maplewood doesn't need another corporate brand, he'd told Daniel early on. It needs a place that belongs to the people who live here. So that's what they built. Inside, tools hung neatly along the walls. There was a whiteboard already filled with schedules, free car care classes, youth apprenticeships, women-only repair nights. A handful of local teens from the high school shop class wandered around with wide eyes, pointing at the lifts like they were pieces of the future. Jason stood at the front as the small crowd gathered, townspeople and curious passers-by, local reporters, even a few skeptical old-timers who hadn't seen Jason since he left town in Daniel's SUV. He cleared his throat. "Most of you know me, and if you don't, you've probably seen my truck break down at least once," he said, earning a soft ripple of laughter. "This shop isn't just mine. It's ours. It's about work that means something, about giving people the tools, literally and figuratively, to take control of their future." Daniel stepped up beside him, and I'm just the guy lucky enough to partner with him. The ribbon snapped clean under Olivia's swing, and cheers broke out. New roots had taken hold, not just in the ground, but in the people. And for Jason, it wasn't just a second chance. It was finally home, reimagined. The conference room was smaller than Daniel was used to. No skyline views, no catered espresso, just folding chairs, a dented coffee pot, and the scent of lemon floor polish lingering in the air. But Jason liked it that way, local, grounded, real. Across the table sat 4 potential investors, 3 in business casual, 1 in a battered flannel jacket who hadn't said a word since he walked in. They weren't venture capitalists or tech billionaires. These were small-town business owners, regional grant managers, and 1 retired factory supervisor with a skeptical glare fixed squarely on Jason. Daniel had kicked off the presentation with the polished ease of a man who'd sold ideas worth billions, charts, projections, strategic partnerships. His confidence filled the room, but the silence afterward wasn't the kind that came from awe. It was the kind that came from doubt. So Jason stood up and did something Daniel never expected. He pushed the slides aside, turned off the projector, and just spoke. "No one here wants to be sold. I get it," he said, voice steady. "I'm not here to promise miracles. I'm here to promise work, real jobs, real training. I know what it's like to pray your car starts in the morning because you can't afford a new starter. I know what it's like to lose sleep over rent. That's who Rootworks is for." He walked slowly in front of the table, meeting each pair of eyes without flinching. "We're not building some shiny showroom. We're building trust. We're teaching kids how to fix an engine and a motherboard. We're giving second chances to people no one else hires. If that doesn't matter, then maybe this place isn't for you." For a long moment, no one said anything. Then the man in the flannel jacket, Jim Rivers, former tool plant foreman, nodded once. "I've got a grandson looking for something better than trouble," he said. "You get him a job that teaches him how to build something with his hands, I'll cut a check." The others followed, slowly, thoughtfully, one by one. As they left the room, Daniel clapped Jason on the back. "Well, I guess we found our closer." Jason just smiled. "Told you, people don't want polish. They want truth." The headline dropped like a grenade. "Billionaire's charity or self-serving stunt? Daniel Cross's small-town project under scrutiny." Jason read the article twice, stomach twisting tighter with every sentence. It painted Rootworks not as a community revival, but as a glossy PR strategy, a calculated move by Daniel Cross to rehab his image through rural goodwill. The photos were cherry-picked. Daniel standing beside local kids, smiling while holding a wrench he hadn't used. Jason in the background, portrayed as the grateful blue-collar puppet in a billionaire's redemption arc. They didn't even mention Olivia. Jason tossed the paper on the counter and ran a hand through his hair. Outside the shop, the parking lot buzzed with activity, but there was a new tension in the air. He could feel it. Conversations pausing when he walked past, eyes lingering too long, the faint smell of doubt creeping into the trust he'd worked so hard to build. Daniel arrived late that afternoon, his jaw clenched and his phone buzzing nonstop in his coat pocket. "I've got legal on it. Our comms team is crafting a response," he said, pacing inside the office. "They twisted everything. Took a volunteer-based project and spun it into some calculated media stunt." Jason leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "And people are buying it." Daniel looked at him, frustration flashing in his eyes. "You think I planned this? That I dragged you into some PR game?" "I don't," Jason said quietly. "But it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what they think. I spent my whole life trying to earn trust out here. One bad headline, and I'm just another guy who sold out." Daniel sat down heavily, the weight of it all pulling at his shoulders. "I never meant for this to fall on you." "I know," Jason said. "But if we're going to keep this thing alive, we don't fight this with press releases." Daniel looked up. "Then how?" "We show them. We keep the doors open. We keep teaching. We keep fixing. And we let the work speak louder than the story." Silence passed between them. Then Daniel nodded slowly. "All right, let's fight it your way." Jason gave a half smile. "Good, because your way's got too many headlines." The event had started out simple enough. Just a community open house at Rootworks. Local press, a few sponsors, some new student enrollees and their families. Balloons bobbed on signposts, the smell of grilled burgers filled the air, and kids ran laughing between workstations like the auto shop was a playground. Jason had one eye on Olivia the entire time. She'd been helping pass out flyers near the registration table, proudly wearing her Rootworks tee, her ponytail bouncing as she handed out papers with all the confidence of someone twice her age. She was smiling, happy, comfortable, until she wasn't. Jason turned his head for no more than a minute, answering a question from a donor, shaking someone's hand, and when he looked back, the table was empty. No Olivia. His heart dropped. He scanned the crowd once, twice, panic rising with each breath. No pink shoes, no ponytail, no laugh. "Olivia?" he called, weaving through the crowd. Nothing. He moved faster now, shoving past camera crews, pushing open the side doors. "Olivia!" His voice was louder now, sharp, raw. A few people noticed. Daniel was one of them. He jogged over, eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" "She's gone," Jason snapped. "She was right here. I turned for a second, 1 second, and she's just gone." Daniel raised a hand, calm but focused. "Okay, we'll find her. I've got security outside and—" "No," Jason barked. This circus, your cameras, your sponsors, your image, this is what put her at risk." Daniel froze, the accusation cutting deeper than either of them expected. Jason didn't wait for a reply. He shoved through the crowd, calling Olivia's name like it was the only word he still knew how to say. Finally, after 5 long, agonizing minutes, he heard a tiny voice behind the main garage door. "I'm here, Daddy." Jason flung it open. Olivia stood beside the vending machine, hugging her bear, her eyes wide and guilty. I got lost trying to find the bathroom." Jason dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, his breath shaky with relief. Daniel stood a few feet away, silent. Jason looked over, eyes still wild. "You want me in your world, Cross? Fine, but don't you ever forget I'm a father first." And in that moment, Daniel understood more than any business deal had ever taught him what it truly meant to have something you couldn't afford to lose. The garage was quiet long after the last car rolled out, the evening light casting long shadows across the oil-streaked floor. Jason leaned against the open bay door, arms crossed, watching Olivia play hopscotch on the sidewalk with chalk she'd fished out of an old drawer. Her laugh echoed softly, the kind of sound that reminded him why he kept showing up, even on the days when the ground beneath him felt like it might give way. Daniel stood a few feet behind him, hands in his pockets, his usual air of control traded for something quieter. He'd been waiting for the right moment all day. "I didn't mean to put her in danger," Daniel said finally. Jason didn't turn. "I know." "She's not mine," Daniel continued, "but I care about her, about you. And that moment, when she disappeared, I felt it too." Jason exhaled. "It's not just about that. I figured." Jason turned then, eyes tired but sharp. "You built your world on control, Daniel, on making sure nothing gets through the cracks. Me? I built mine on holding things together with duct tape and prayer. I can't afford cracks. And I can't afford to let Olivia become part of something I don't understand." Daniel stepped closer, his voice low. "I've spent years designing a life where nothing surprised me. But you? Olivia? This partnership? None of that was in the plan. And I think that scared the hell out of me." Jason offered a grim smile. "You and me both." They stood in silence, the air between them still heavy but not hostile. "I'm not trying to drag you into my world," Daniel said. "I'm trying to build a new one, with you. Something better, but I can't do it pretending I'm still the man who can keep everything neatly under control, because I'm not. Not anymore." Jason looked at Olivia, now drawing a sun with a smiley face on the pavement. "I want her to grow up in a place that teaches her not to be afraid of risk," he said softly, "but also not to forget who she is, who we are." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then let's build that place. Together." Jason held out his hand, and for the first time, it wasn't just a handshake between two men from different worlds. It was the start of a shared one. The first snow of the season drifted down in slow, lazy spirals, softening the edges of the world and silencing the streets of Maplewood. Rootwork stood dark behind them, its lights off, its doors locked, the warmth of the day tucked away inside. Jason and Daniel lingered by the fence line behind the shop, where the noise of the town gave way to stillness. A light dusting of snow had settled on their shoulders and hair, but neither of them moved. Jason exhaled, watching his breath cloud in the cold air. "I used to think snow was just another chore. Shovel the driveway, salt the steps, fix a busted heater for someone who can't afford to wait." Daniel glanced sideways at him, a soft smile playing at his lips. "You ever let yourself just watch it fall?" Jason shook his head. "Not until now." They stood there shoulder to shoulder, silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with all the things they hadn't yet said. "You ever think," Daniel said quietly, "how strange it is that someone you weren't supposed to meet becomes the person who changes everything?" Jason turned, his eyes meeting Daniel's. "Yeah, I think about that more than I want to admit." The snowflakes caught in Daniel's hair, glinting faintly under the streetlight, and for a moment Jason saw him differently. Not as a billionaire, not as a business partner, but as a man, unguarded, real, standing there like he was waiting for something to make sense. And maybe Jason had stopped waiting. Maybe the lines they'd been so careful to draw had already blurred. He stepped closer, just enough to cross the space that had separated them for months. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. And then, without ceremony, without permission from pride or fear or logic, Jason kissed him. It wasn't long, it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. When they pulled apart, Daniel's breath hitched, a surprised laugh escaping. "Took you long enough." Jason smirked, cheeks flushed from cold, and something else entirely. "Yeah, but I don't do things halfway." And under that snow-dusted sky, with no press, no plan, no expectations, just stars overhead and truth between them, something unspoken finally became real. The SUV rumbled quietly along the back roads just outside Maplewood, headlights carving soft tunnels through the early morning mist. Inside, the silence wasn't awkward, it was earned, comfortable. The kind that came after surviving storms together and realizing you no longer needed to fill every space with words. Daniel sat in the passenger seat for once, elbow resting on the door, watching the fields blur past. Jason drove with one hand on the wheel, the other curled loosely in his lap. Olivia had stayed behind with a neighbor for the morning, her idea proudly announced with a wink and a "grown-ups need alone time too." Jason glanced over, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "You sure you don't miss city traffic and security escorts?" Daniel chuckled. "Not even a little, though I do miss my espresso machine." "I can rig something up," Jason offered. "Might involve jumper cables and a coffee pot from 1993. Daniel laughed, the sound easy, unguarded. "That's the most terrifying and tempting thing I've heard all week." They passed the spot where it had all started, just a curve in the road, a patch of gravel where a broken-down sedan once steamed in the cold, and two strangers stood on opposite sides of everything they thought they knew. Daniel leaned forward, pointing. "That's where I found you." Jason raised an eyebrow. "I found you. You were the one stranded, remember?" "I wasn't the one with the blown radiator," Daniel said with a grin. Jason shot him a look. "And you weren't the one with a toolbox and a 7-year-old in the back seat." They laughed again, and then it settled. The realization of how far they'd come. Not just miles or months, but deep down. From assumptions to understanding. From guarded to open. From two men on opposite ends of the world to something that no longer needed a label. Jason's voice was softer when he spoke again. "You know, when I stopped to help you that day, I figured I'd never see you again." Daniel looked at him quiet for a moment. "Funny, I've never stopped seeing you since." They drove on, not toward a destination, but toward whatever came next, together, because it was never just a ride. It was the beginning of everything. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over the worn wood floors and the mismatched mug sitting on the counter. Olivia sat cross-legged at the table, focused on a puzzle, humming a tune she'd made up days ago. Jason stood at the stove flipping pancakes, and Daniel, still half asleep in sweatpants and a threadbare hoodie, leaned against the doorway with a mug of coffee in hand, watching it all unfold like a scene he didn't realize he'd been waiting for his whole life. This wasn't the city. It wasn't the penthouse with its mirrored walls and spotless silence. It wasn't polished or curated or camera-ready. But it was home. The new place wasn't fancy, a 2-story farmhouse with creaky steps and a roof that would need patching come spring. But it had a yard for Olivia to run in, a garage out back for Jason's tools and projects, and enough sunlight to make everything feel a little softer. They'd kept Rootworks running strong with Jason mentoring kids from the community and Daniel handling the strategy and expansion plans from the ground up, this time without the PR spin or corporate leash. They'd made it a place that changed lives, not just cars. But the real change had happened here, in the quiet nights when Daniel learned how to fall asleep without headphones or distractions. In the mornings when Jason stopped waiting for the next thing to go wrong. In the spaces between where Olivia flourished, no longer just adapting, but belonging. Jason plated the last pancake and set it in front of Olivia, ruffling her hair before sliding into the seat next to Daniel. She added bacon to the grocery list, he murmured, smirking. Daniel raised an eyebrow. We're raising a genius. Jason glanced at him, something warm settling behind his eyes. No, we're raising a life. They didn't need to say it, but it hung in the air between them anyway. Gratitude, love, and the quiet promise of staying, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Outside, the snow had melted, the ground thawing into something new. And inside, in a kitchen filled with the smell of syrup and laughter, they were finally home.